things that we're going to be seeing now, that we have seen, really require a lot of unpacking, and we're looking really at the header points. And I want to make sure, like yesterday, we learned the halacha about posting bills on a public wall, right? You have to make sure that you have permission to post a sign on an area that is adjacent to the public thoroughfare, because if it's private property, you won't have permission to do that. And what are the circumstances behind that? Like, what are the limitations? What about posting a sticker on a municipally owned utility pole? Is that legal? Right? Is that considered defacing public property? I think that there may be an issue. One would have to know what the penal code is of the city before posting something, and even if other people are doing it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's legal. Here's another sweeping statement that we're seeing in the Likutim that needs to be unpacked carefully, but we're just going to see a one-liner. He says, "Mutter lahazik mamon chavero kidei lahafrisho mi iser im al yedei zeh yimna chavero meha isur." He's quoting a sefer now that says that you're allowed to damage your friend's property if that will help stop him from performing a sin. If you can prevent him from doing an isser, you're allowed to damage his property. So he says, so what does that mean? He says, I'm going to McDonald's. No, you can't go to McDonald's. Yes. No. And you take out a baseball bat and you smash his car, right? I mean, obviously that's not going to be permitted. So that can't be what this halacha is saying, that you're allowed to damage his property in order to prevent him from doing an isser. But it has to be quantified. There's very, very, very little qualification in this particular halacha, but in very, very limited circumstances, let's say your friend is about to do something destructive, perhaps even self-destructive, you would be allowed to. You need to stop him, even if it means damaging his property. Let's say he wants to try and jump off the roof. And in order to stop him from harming himself, you need to tear his garment or something like that. So then you're allowed to do that. But again, it has to be quantified. Hamazik b'derech seguli hi chayav ayin b'kilas Yaakov b'vakamasim elamates mashakasav bazeh. If you injure someone's property, but you do so in a way that will help them, derech seguli, you try to benefit them in some way. Whether or not you're going to be liable, he says, I refer you to the Stipler's Sefer Kilas Yaakov, where he discusses this. Again, a longer discussion, going back to the issue of the physician that harms a patient in the course of trying to cure them. Nahag shenir dam. Toch kedei nesiato, b'sata al yedei zeh harechav mehakabish, v'nitapech, v'nizuko hayoshvim sham. Okay, a guy is driving a car and he falls asleep. And as a result of his falling asleep, he veers off the road and he either injures people or injures their property. So is he liable for that kind of damage or not? So the halacha is, and here he's quoting from the Sefer Vayan David. I don't know who that is. And he says, yes, of course you are chayev. And what's the reason why this person is chayev? The kaven de teva ha'adam shelifnei shuhu nirdam nofel alav ayefut. He says, because every person before they fall asleep, unless he has some kind of medical condition, but people before they fall asleep get tired. And havi leila atzor tarechev lanuach ma'at olihi tra'anei. Then the person, as soon as he started getting tired, should have become aware at that point, I may fall asleep. And therefore he should have either pulled over to the side of the road, or he should have aroused himself. The cave in Delo Asakain, havi le poshea ve'ein zaonis. And because he did not do so, because this was an act of negligence, to allow yourself to get so tired, to get so drowsy as to fall asleep behind the wheel, you are negligent. Ulam im asa kenal ve'afal piche nirdam befesa pison belila hargish lifnei ze klum. But if you can ascertain that maybe he has some kind of condition, maybe it was an epileptic fit, or maybe he just happened to just fall into an unconscious state from a completely conscious state. And he talks about this medical condition. So if a person falls into an immediate state of unconsciousness, so then you could exempt him if you could ascertain that he indeed had this medical condition. But you also have to investigate. I mean, this is also not so clear. What if a person has epilepsy and he's been diagnosed with epilepsy, and God forbid he has a seizure while he's driving and therefore causes damage? Well, anyone who is diagnosed with epilepsy, one of the first things the doctor tells you is you cannot drive anymore, right? So that in itself may be an act of pishia, because you should not be driving if you are given to seizures and to falling into a state of unconsciousness spontaneously. What is the law here in Canada? Is a person with epilepsy permitted to drive? Joby, can you?
No, it's the first thing they do, actually. And even if there's any suspect of a sudden loss of consciousness, they inform the Ministry of Transportation and they suspend your license immediately until it's all worked out medically.
Okay. Thank you for that. All right. No, it's a terrible situation, because you feel terrible for the person, because first they have a debilitating disease and you don't want to punish them for that. But unfortunately, for public safety, you have to. You don't really have a choice. Anyway, okay. Chayavim benezek afilu anus the adamu ad laolam ben shogeg ben mezid ben ben yashen. So as we learned before in the Imrei Yaakov, a person is always going to be chayav for the damage that they cause, even if it was totally unintentional. And that includes sometimes cases of onus, sometimes cases of really mishap, as long as it's not complete mishap, like we learned before. If it's completely, there was nothing that the person could have done, like we saw like the case where he was already sleeping and the guy put down something fragile next to him while he was asleep and he rolls over, so then he's not going to be held liable. But if he fell asleep knowing that there were fragile items next to him, then while it's true that he's totally in anus when he rolled over them because he was totally unconscious, then he's going to be chayav. So bamed dvarim amurim sheyashen chayav k'sheyashnu shehem ke'echad. He says, so when do we say that a person who causes damage in his sleep is going to be chayav? So when you have two people, let's say two people are sleeping in the same room, v'nitapech echad mehem al chaveru ve'ezika o kara begadav. And we both, like, let's say, a husband and a wife. I don't know if that's the right example. Maybe two guys in yeshiva happen to fall asleep together. They were both exhausted. And one guy rolls over on the other guy and ends up injuring him or tearing his clothing. So then the person is going to be liable. He's going to be liable because he knew that there was someone next to him. And if you know that there's someone next to you and you injure them, even in your sleep, you're going to be liable. But if your friend came along while you were already asleep, and then he went and laid down next to you, or he put down utensils next to you, and then you injure him, so then you're going to be patur. And if it's any kind of complete mishap where there was no way for you to protect yourself from damaging someone else's property, so then you're going to be patur. Mishanofel min hagag beruach mitsuya v'hizik. A person falls off a roof and he ends up causing injury by falling on either utensils or on people. So, and the way he fell off the roof was not because of some, hurricane gale winds, but just because it was so windy that, and he should have known that there's a potential for him to fall off if the wind blows. So then chayav b'daled dvarim. He's going to be liable for 4 different categories of damage. And we're not going to get into the 4 categories of damage now, but there's, we'll see later on that you're not just liable for the replacement costs, but if you injure someone, you have to pay for their medical bills, you have to pay for their workers' comp. There's a lot of stuff that you have to cover. And the shoge karav lemezidhu delo hayelo lalos lagag sheyachol lipol misham beruach mitzuya. You're called a shogeg because you knew that when you went up to the roof, there's an occupational hazard and there's always a chance that you're going to fall off the roof. Socher shasiyim schiruso umasar maftechos hadira lemaskir v'shachach lechabot edud ha'elektri. Okay, so let's talk about the following case. You rented a room, okay, and you're checking out. You finished renting the room, and you give the keys of the apartment, like sort of like an Airbnb, or perhaps you were renting for a long-term period. You give the keys to the landlord, but you left the Duda electric, the electric solar heater, which is what is in charge of heating the water. And in Israel, this is a very common thing. What you do is when you want to heat up the water, you turn on the electric solar heater. It's sort of like it's both electric and solar. So when it's on solar heat, it doesn't cost any money. But if you need water, more hot water than that, you flip a switch and it heats the water. But the problem is that it costs money whenever the switch is on, right? So you ended up, what you did was you left the electricity on in an empty apartment, and your landlord is liable for all utilities. And as a result, it could have been a couple $100 by the time the landlord found out that you left the switch on, causing the water to be continuously heated by the electricity, but running up a huge bill over the course of a few days. In that case, the renter does have to pay for that, because that's considered to be wanton damage. So this is a scenario where, in a hotel today, you don't have to pay for any switches you leave on. But let's say you're renting a room. You have a legal obligation to make sure that you don't cause the landlord to incur additional costs because you neglected to turn off the utilities. Same thing would be true not just with the solar heater, but with, let's say, you leave the air conditioner on, and the landlord specifically gives you instructions that when you're done, you have to turn off all the electricity. So then you're going to be chayiv in that case. Okay, that's an interesting tshuva in the Shevet Halevi, which is a contemporary tshuva.
Sorry, Rabbi, that very last point, would they have to give you specific instruction, or is it kind of understood?
I don't think they have to give you specific instruction. No, I think that's
you think it's understood?
I think it's implicit in most contractual arrangements. The landlord guarantees to pay for your utilities while you're during the rental period, right? But so it's probably good to have this all in a contract. But in the I think this is Rav Vosner. He probably discusses it in more depth. If you wanted to us to go into this tshuva, I could open up the tshuva right now. We could take a look inside. It's really up to you.
Up to everyone. I'm also curious as to whether the landlord has an obligation to go back and like after
Right.
the tenant is gone, and you can't just sort of wait 2 weeks and then go back.
Right. That's right. How long of a period does the tenant have to pay for before the landlord becomes negligent for not having checked the apartment? Let me just take a look here. Let me bring it up for 1 second. David Halevi, Chelek Zion. What does it say? Chelek Zion. Siman Reish Lamed Daled. Okay. Okay, so I'll bring this up. Okay, everyone see it on their screen. This was written in 1988. This tshuva was written, and it was written to Rabbi Eliezer Stern, who was the author of our work that we're doing. I think this is Rabbi Eliezer Stern, who's the author of the Imrei Yaakov. So, isn't that interesting? That he is this is Yaakov Meir Stern. So this could be a relative of his who was asking the question. So Odot Dud Shebein Socher Lamaskir. So we're dealing with a water heater that is in the apartment. So the rental period is over. He relinquishes the apartment back to the landlord, to the either the owner of the could be the owner of the apartment. And he so the landlord examined the apartment when he got the keys back. Adira amda rekat kufama. And the apartment was vacant for a certain amount of time. And after a certain amount of time, the landlord discovered that the renter had forgotten to turn off the water heater, and it was on for this whole time. And the landlord is expecting the renter to pay the electric bill for that time where the apartment was vacant and he was racking up a utility bill. And the renter's counterclaim is, sounds like a legitimate counterclaim, is, but wait a minute. When I gave you the keys, you came to examine the premises. You came to examine the apartment. I gave you the keys. You checked every room to make sure there was no damage. And it's your responsibility. Why should it be my responsibility? So this adds an added dimension, an added layer of complexity, right? In other words, the renter has a very valid counterclaim. Why should I be liable for the fact, you came and examined the premises. So if anything, it's your responsibility. You also could have checked to make sure that all the electricity is turned off. Like in a situation with air conditioning, that would be noticeable right away if the air conditioning was left on, right? On the one hand, you want to argue that we should hold the tenant liable because it was his action that turned on the heater. On the other hand, we could also argue that if I turn on your water heater, I'm considered to be a mazik because I'm causing you to lose money. But in our case over here, the renter turned on the water heater while it was still his right to use the water heater. And he used it perfectly legally. And therefore, you should only hold him liable as he did an act of grama by not turning it off. But when he turned it on, he did an active act of it wasn't an act of damage at that time. Va'od ulai al yedei shemaskir siyer b'dirato b'tomas chirut nifkach rayuto shel hasocher im elu tochen dvarav ma'alato habiri. And furthermore, you want to argue that the landlord went through the entire premises as the tenant left, and so it should no longer be the responsibility of the tenant; it should be the responsibility of the landlord. But it would seem to me quite obvious, and just to be clear, this was Rav Vosner who's writing this. He says, it seems clear to me that the renter, the tenant, is liable. The imishum grama ba'alma, ariyesh omrim dechol grama chayv imidi d'shchiach. He says, first of all, we have to establish that there are some poskim who say that even when you do a causative kind of damage, a grama, you can still be held liable if this is a prevalent form of damage. Uv'chol nikra rasha, as the Shulchan Aruch writes, and either way, you're still called a wicked person, even if we can't hold you liable. He says, and even if you're going to say, well, the Shach disagrees with the Rama and says that any causative damage you're not going to be held liable for, but this is different over here. He says, he says, because this was a direct action, because you turned on the switch. And what about your argument that when you turned on the switch, you were doing it within your rights and it wasn't a damaging act? Ein zutaina the sofal ma'asav chayv b'tashlumi ha'elektri mishalim zalidei demei haschirus oim hu mishalim b'zman haschirus cheshbanot ha'elektri. He says, but that's not a valid argument because at the end of the day, the landlord has to pay for the electric bill, and it doesn't matter that he's paying for it. If he's paying for it for using the rental money that he got for renting the apartment, he says, and we have this concept in the Gemara called the damage of fire, that even if I light a fire on my property, but that fire travels to someone else's property, I'm going to be liable for that damage because I had a responsibility to stop the fire from spreading. So even though I turned on the switch at a time when it was within my right, but I leave that switch uncontrolled and unregulated, and it goes ahead and extends beyond my boundaries, beyond the time that I'm allowed to be using the hot water heater, so then I should be held liable. Right? The ein mashahadir achshav birshut hamaskir v'hacheshbon bal shemo siba liftor hasocher. He says, and therefore, the fact that he's no longer the renter anymore, he says, that's not enough of a reason to exempt the renter. So he says, so that's the first argument, is that this is like the damage of Aish, that I started legally on my property and it spread to someone else's property. So too over here. I was within my rights to turn on the switch when I was a renter, but to leave that switch on uncontrolled it doesn't, and just because of the fact that it's no longer my period of tenancy, it doesn't exempt me. It's still continuing. The damage is continuing. Va'od bar mindain lanias daiti. He says, I'll give you one more argument. Ilfitanai haschirus bizman hazeh shehem matnim kol pam shahasocher chayv lahami lo chazara hadira b'shleimut b'lina zikim. He says it's an implicit contract. Whenever you rent a property, you as a tenant have an obligation to return the property back in a way where there's no damage, residual damage after you've rented the property. You have to return back the property intact the way it was before you got it. In Cain, part and parcel of that contract, whether that's tacit or whether that's written explicitly, is that you accept upon yourself to return the apartment without any deficiencies, without any loss. And it makes no difference whether damage was caused to the apartment through direct causation or whether it was indirect. In other words, when there's an obligation for you to leave the apartment intact at the end of your tenancy, the landlord doesn't care whether that hole in the wall that you caused is a product of your direct action or whether it happened by accident or whether, you just failed to turn off a machine that bashed a hole in the wall. It doesn't make a difference. He says, you're going to tell me that if the walls in the apartment collapse because a guy did something indirect to cause them to collapse, right? He brought an elephant into the apartment and the elephant went around and smashed into the wall. Are you going to tell me that because it wasn't directly caused by him that he's going to be exempt? Of course not. Obviously, whenever you return an apartment, it doesn't make a difference why it's not in its original condition. You have to pay for whatever damage was caused. So fine. So that's the argument that the tenant is going to be liable to pay for leaving the electricity on. Now, what about the argument that the landlord went through the apartment at the end of the tenancy? So he should have discovered this. He says, "Lanias daiti eno taina kolkach." He says, in my opinion, that's not enough of an argument. He says, "The derech b'nei adam l'sayer v'lirot mashani kar la'inayim." He says, because a landlord, when he examines the premises, checks things that are clearly recognizable. The Imrei eze nezek v'lo oreret hasocher savar v'kibel. So when you see some overt damage to the unit, okay, and you don't object and you don't say anything, so that's a tacit forgiveness of the damage. So let's say there's a scratch on the wall or there's a bit of a gash on the wall and it can be fixed through a little bit of plaster and paint. So that's something that if the landlord looks over and he doesn't say anything, that's an indication he can't come back to you later and say, I need to charge you for this, right? Because it was agreed that everything is in okay condition, right? He says, but the fact that he didn't notice that the switch was turned on is not something that is immediately recognizable. And that was a negligent act of the renter. It's not even something that the landlord would have thought to check when he does his final inspection of the apartment. That's his argument, says Rav Wasner. And therefore, it seems very clear to me that you have to pay. Okay, so that's the tshuva. Now, the only thing that I would say is that it could be that the only point that I would make, perhaps in objection to this argument, is that a landlord has an obligation really to make himself a checklist of things that I need to check before I hold the tenant to be off the hook for anything in the apartment. And one of the things he has to check is, are all of the utilities turned off, including the water heater. And so I'm a bit surprised that Rav Wasner came out so strongly to hold the tenant liable. I'm not sure if that would hold so true today. I don't know. I mean, first of all, he's writing this it's not so long ago that he wrote this tshuva. It's a little bit over 30 years ago that he wrote this tshuva. So it's not such an old tshuva. But I am surprised. I think that you would have to make an argument that this is, there are some water heaters that when you turn them on, there's a little light that turns on also. And there are other water heaters that might be older that when you turn them on, there's no light that goes on. So I think a lot of it would have to do with the circumstances, but I think this is a good case history, sort of like a good legal case to use sort of as an indication that, number one, it's not always so simple. And number two, there are situations where if it's not something conspicuous that I should have known that the damage was being caused, I can hold the tenant liable because the damage may be a hidden form of damage, such that even after I examine the premises, I inspect the premises, I may not find it immediately. Okay, so I think we'll hold it here for today. Thank you for prodding us to look up the tshuva.
Fascinating. I'm thinking about a modern day example of renting a car, and when you return it, they check it for damage. And I guess after you've signed off and left, if they then subsequently find something, I don't know that they can come back to you because they've checked it and said, okay, you're free to go.
Yeah, but what if they discover that you poured sugar down the gas?
Right. Gas. So that's this case, really, an unrecognizable damage.
Right.
So it's interesting. It does have modern day application too.
Yeah. I mean,
fascinating.
Clearly in a situation like that, if you poured sugar down the gas tank and they can ascertain that it was damage caused during your rental period, then probably there is a clause in the law that would allow them to have to be able to go after you.
Thank you for going through the case.
Another example was maybe they took it onto the 407 and accumulated some fees, which is also in the contract.
What was that, Izzy? Could you say that again?
Another example would be where you rented a car and took it onto the 407 and acquired fees,
right?
Which didn't show up until.
Right, that's right. That's actually built in. I think that they build that into the billing, right? Because they just charge your credit card afterwards for it.
Yeah, it's correct.
Okay.